Good evening, fight fans. This is the Radulich and Broadcasting Network premier podcast, the complete history of heavyweight championship boxing, Chapter 2. Tonight we are focusing on the great lineal heavyweight champion, number 9 on our list, between Jess Willard and Gene Tunney, Mr. Jack Dempsey. Jack Dempsey was born June 25th, 1985, passed away May 31st, 1983. He competed from 1914 to 1927 and reigned as the world heavyweight champion from 1919 to 1926. And for those of you who love the Roaring Twenties, let me edit that. For those of you who knew what the Roaring Twenties were and loved them, he was a cultural icon. He's one of the greats, and we're going to talk about him and a few of his premier fights, his most well-known fights. And here to help me do that, to keep me on track as he always does, the punchy pugilist, the boxing historian, a man who never forgets to duck, Pat Mullin. How do you do, sir?
I wouldn't say that's in all true, but yeah, this is the second real iconic champion that we're going to cover in this series. So this episode is really going to be devoted to the guy who was the biggest sports hero of the 1920s, which is pretty big when you consider that era evokes Babe Ruth, Red Grange, Bobby Jones, and Bill Tilden.
The first thing I want to point out, I was talking with John War when we were doing our coverage, our boxing coverage a weekend or so ago, and we were talking about, it's kind of an embarrassment of riches in terms of available boxing to the general public. You could have watched something as small of a show as was on Fight this past weekend, something called Rock the Bells. There was the Anthony Joshua, Andy Ruiz fight on DAZN. There were fights on Showtime, fights on ESPN. And that's not even getting into wrestling and mixed martial arts, just boxing. And so here we are in 2019 with cameras everywhere and your ability to watch boxing all over the world almost at any given time. And I think the way that I read this, I don't know how you feel about it, but the way that I read this is the man responsible for that is Jack Dempsey, as his fights were the first that really kicked off the era of broadcast sports around the United States and then the world.
Yeah, which is true. And a lot of that is not only due to the fact that, because even with Jack Johnson, saw that fight with fights filmed in their entirety, and it really had a lot to do with, one, that he was a white champion in a white man's era, but also the style he presented was one where we talked about how the perception of the heavyweight champion is, this is a guy who can go one-on-one with anybody in the world and beat them senseless. And his style was the personification of that for years to come, and in many ways still is.
What's ironic to me and kind of funny is how these chapters that we're doing seem to be, without us meaning them to be, almost a response to a recent happening in boxing. Because Anthony Joshua and Andy Ruiz had their rematch this past weekend as we're recording this. And I don't want to get too much into that fight, but the big criticism was Anthony Joshua circled and jabbed and outpointed and outclassed Andy Ruiz with superior technique. I'm not going to get into the lack of training and all of that on Ruiz's side. That's a different podcast. But what came out of that was at least half the people who have access to social media and were watching and decided to complain about it, complained, oh, that wasn't a very interesting fight. This happened also with Mayweather and Pacquiao. It was the fight of the century. It was the two best boxers in the world, yada, yada, yada. It was like a $1 zillion pay-per-view. And, Floyd Mayweather, as we've talked about on a variety of different podcasts, really, really good about not being hit, constant movement and everything else. Casual boxing fans look at that and go, well, that's not very fun to watch. And here you have Jack Dempsey, who's mauling people bigger than him like a bear, which we'll talk about in just a moment, who is all kinds of fun to watch. So I can see why there's something to be said for, and in preparation for this, we talked about I watched the Dempsey made-for-TV movie from the early 80s, and there's a line in there about people don't go to see a boxing match to watch boxing. They go to see a fight. And if nothing else, Jack Dempsey brought the fight to every single one of his opponents. I mean, is he solely responsible for the reason why we have a neutral corner rule? Because he should be.
Technically, yes, and we'll get into
that. So where do you want to begin with Mr. Jack here? He doesn't get his heavyweight title fight until he's got like 67 fights to his name, according to his Wikipedia page. And he, at the time of that, he's 47-4-9, having just fought Gunboat. These are some of the best names ever. Gunboat Smith on December 30th, 1918. He'll fight Jess Willard July 4th, 1919. So where do you want to begin this story?
So the funny thing is, and we look at these gaps in fights, a lot of the fights are not recorded in between those times, as is common during the time. We talked about that a little bit with Jack Johnson in our last episode. But, you know, we left off with everybody where Jess Willard had won the championship in Cuba from Johnson, allegedly on a dive, allegedly not. Nobody really knows the true story behind that. Willard makes one defense of the title. He fights a fellow named Frank Moran, who he had already fought in the past, and it goes to a draw. And Willard at this point is kind of not really interested in doing a lot. He's kind of just hanging out, collecting his money, and just not really interested in fighting because he's made it to the top already. There's not really anything that's enticing him to stick around too long. And so they negotiate this fight with this up-and-comer Dempsey, who has been really getting a lot of word of mouth from people about what a hitter he is and how this is the guy who can really just take things to the next level. And he's managed at the time by Doc Kearns, who is a very savvy person that Dempsey had hooked up with in New York when he was thinking about quitting. And he's fought some of the better names of the time. You mentioned Gunboat Smith, who is one of the top contenders, and he knocked him out in 2 rounds. He's fought guys like Fireman Jim Flynn and the St. Paul Thunderbolt, Billy Miskey. So he's the most logical contender to the title, and people who've seen him fight are very excited because of that style that he brings. So they set this fight up as like a not centennial, but you know, your Happy Birthday America event, which a lot of the big fights in the early days were scheduled around 4th of July.
Which would make sense. You know, people are off from work, presumably. It's a holiday. Families are out. They're looking for things to do, and of course, this is 1919, so people are, this is the era of state fairs and traveling circuses and all of that, and carnivals. So it would make sense that they would try to create an event on a holiday. The fight takes place in Bayview Park, Toledo, Ohio, and apparently it was 1 billion degrees out that day.
So they had constructed extra bleacher seating for this fight, but the wood they used was filled with sap. So as the sun beat down and the wood heated, people, and this was when a prize fight was a very classy affair, people are coming in 3-piece suits and their Sunday best, and the sap ruined God knows how many suits from just melting out of this wood onto the suits.
That is fantastic. I actually remember that from the documentary I watched from an old HBO documentary, and it talked about how many a 3-piece suit were ruined by wood sap. It's fantastic. Let's get into the fight itself. Now, At this point, had Jack Dempsey been known for having an extremely aggressive style, and when you talk about this, I want you to also bleed into the fact that there's no neutral corner rule at this point, so you can literally stand over your opponent as they're counting, and the minute he gets off the mat, hit him again.
Yeah, so again, the neutral corner rule is a rule that was put into effect, and we'll talk about that later in the episode, where when you knock down an opponent, you are forced to retreat to a neutral corner, meaning you cannot go to your own corner, you cannot go to the corner of your opponent. You are directed by the referee into one of the two neutral corners to allow your opponent time to stand up. And later on, an addendum to that would be made that the opponent would have to take a mandatory 8 count in addition. However, at this time, that's not in existence. And Dempsey, who is known for just being this bob and weave aggressor, unleashing combinations, springing up like a cobra, was known for when he dropped somebody, he had the ability to stand and hover above them. And as soon as 3 points of contact were no longer on the ground, it was only 2 points of contact, he could unleash another flurry and really do some damage. And this fight, it's arguably the most one-sided,
shellacking
beating.
Okay, shellacking is what it was.
Yeah, it's unbelievable the amount of savagery and the amount of punishment that's dished out in such a short window of time. And that's only the first round. This goes into the third.
Let me describe this for the people. So, first of all, just the size comparison. If you ever watch Rocky III and you see Sylvester Stallone standing in the ring with Thunderlips Hulk Hogan, kind of looks like that. I didn't really see Jack Dempsey was even this tall. He's billed as 6'1" against the apparently 8 foot tall. I believe he's actually 6'6", but he just looks huge, in comparison to Jess Willard. And I guess the thinking for those, and this gets talked about actually in the movie, that Jess Willard is so big. They also bring this up in the documentary. He's so big, and he's got such large paws that he's afraid he's going to kill this little guy. This little guy is 6'1", by the way, but I digress. They're afraid this bear is going to maul this midget, and it has to be guaranteed that if murder is committed in the middle of the ring, he will not be arrested. And then the fight starts, and Jack Dempsey, like Taz, I don't mean the wrestler, I mean the cartoon character, runs across the ring, proceeds to duck under this wide swinging straight from Willard and break this guy's body down, deliver super fast combinations, and knocks him to the ground moments into the fight. And so, as Pat was saying, he would stand over him, ready to hit him again. And at that point, it's a mugging. There's no boxing happening in the rest of that round. He would literally get to to one hand on the mat, and fucking Jack Dempsey would hit him again. And sometimes he would withstand it just enough or shove Jack Dempsey away and try to get some distance. But Jack Dempsey, like a man possessed, like Jess Willard owed him money, just kept beating on him.
Funny you should bring up that he owed him money.
Go ahead, sir.
So prior to the fight starting, and I mean literally when the gentlemen have been introduced and they're standing in their corners ready to go, Jack Kearns allegedly says to Dempsey, "I've bet our whole purse that you'll stop him in the first round."
So that leads to a bit of controversy, as I recall.
Slightly, yes.
So, 7 or 8 knockdowns later, in this mugging that took place, we reach the end of the round. There's no bell as such. Jack Dempsey, I believe, thinks that Jess Willard has been knocked out, took the full 10, but they're yelling from the corner, no, the round's over, he's saved by the bell, which I don't think you can be anymore. And so Jack's like, well, I won the fight, cool, and just splits. He takes off. And the corners are like, no, get him back here. There's still a fight happening. So no, he unfortunately did not. Depending on how you look at it, he did not knock him out in the first round. He knocked him down 900 times, but didn't knock him out. And so they went to a second and third round where he will eventually knock this guy out.
Yeah, Willard it took a horrific beating in the first round. You will not see anything like that really almost ever, and certainly not today. And the fact that he was still willing to go says a lot about his character and says a lot about how much his corner really probably didn't like him to allow him to go back out into that and just take more and more. And eventually they stop it after the third round. And at that point, he has broken ribs. His cheekbone is broken. They thought he had broken his jaw, which he didn't. One eye is completely blackened and shut. He just he took as bad a beating as you'll ever see anybody take, and it just really established Dempsey as everything that people thought he was.
If you look at the original fight footage, which is available on YouTube, you can see a plate-sized hematoma on the side of Willard's face. Whatever other injuries he sustained, and apparently there's a discrepancy as to whether or not he sustained all of those injuries. You can absolutely see the side of his face. It has been bruised beyond recognition. And to the point that people believe Jack Dempsey hit him with a railroad spike, a knuckle duster, a tree, a hammer.
The most common one that was spread over the years was that he had used plaster of Paris on his hand wraps.
That seems to have been spread by a sourpuss Kearns after he had been fired.
That's exactly what it came from. If you look at footage, they actually show Dempsey's hands being examined before the fight. Nat Fleischer, who was editor of Ring Magazine, was present when Dempsey's hands were wrapped. So Kearns, one who had nothing to do with it. It was just highly speculatory. But what it does is when you find out that's all bunk, you think about how he did all that with just his two hands to this giant.
I want to thread this back into one of our main objectives here is to kind of compare how, where boxing came from and where it went to where it ultimately landed today. And two things that I thought about while watching this fight. One, a guy as big as Jess Willard, probably Tyson Fury. But Tyson Fury doesn't move like a lumbering, like Andre the Giant. Like when I saw Jess Willard throw a punch, and maybe this is the downside of his career, and that might be one explanation for it. But where Tyson Fury is a lot more dynamic technique and some pretty fast movement, you have a guy who's around the same size, I think, as Tyson Fury, who's moving like an old school 80s lumbering giant wrestler. By the same token, if you look at some of the just in heavyweight, you look at some of the modern heavyweight boxers, you don't see guys going this crazy in the ring anymore. So I'm wondering if, is there an analog to either one of these guys in boxing today? And could either one of these guys even get away with their mutual styles of boxing, in your opinion?
Well, Dempsey introduced a lot of technique that has been refined over time. I mean, if you and you're a Mike Tyson fan, Mike Tyson idolized Jack Dempsey when he was shown footage of what he did, and it's very evident in him stylistically what he did with the bobbing and weaving and head movement, and then just unleashing torrents of punches very quickly inside on taller opponents. So I think that style is what the modern day analog to Dempsey would be. There's not a lot of guys who attack with that same fury and aggression that he has. And the few that do, they don't really combine it with any sense of defense, of hand positioning, head movement, and upper body movement.
Yeah, they seem to do the bending over and shoving your head in the guy's chest real well, but then that's about as far as it goes.
Yeah, I mean, like even a guy like, say, Vasily Lomachenko, who is not known as an aggressive fighter or an offensive torrent. But when he is on the inside, he uses a lot of the upper body head shifts, lets a quick combination of punches go, but then he usually reestablishes distance. Whereas Dempsey didn't want no part of distance. He's inside to rip you up and tear you apart.
And I would say, I think most of the heavyweights at this point, certainly the ones at the top of the food chain, Deontay Wilder, Anthony Joshua, Tyson Fury, none of them move as slow as Jess Willard did.
The athleticism is so much better than what it was then, especially for large guys.
Sure. So, your new lineal heavyweight champion, the great Jack Dempsey. From there, he would defend his title a few months later. He would get a third-round KO of 10 rounds against Billy Misk in Floyd Fitzsimmons Arena in Benton Harbor, Michigan. He then goes on to fight Billy Brennan. He KOs him in 12 rounds out of 15, and that's December 14th, 1920.
Big Bill Brennan, arguably the toughest fight of his career, because after 10 rounds, Brennan led on all the scorecards. And Dempsey was bleeding from his ear. He was concussed, and really not in a good way, and was basically told in his corner, like, hey, you need to go do something about this. And he finally was able to catch up with Brennan, hurt him in the 11th round, and finished him in the 12th.
What was giving Jack Dempsey fits going into those last few rounds that he was losing on all the scorecards?
Well, unfortunately, with the lack of footage available, it's tough to really get everything that you needed from that. But Brennan was similar in size to Dempsey, so he had a very hard time in terms of establishing proper distance where he wanted it. Brennan was known for fighting Harry Greb, who was somebody who had given Dempsey real trouble. And Brennan could fight on the inside. So he constantly caught Dempsey with this right uppercut through the fight. And he was doing real well and just turning and moving, keeping Dempsey turning. But eventually Dempsey did his best to land body shots throughout the fight because he had such a hard time catching Brennan upstairs. And the punch that really hurt him was a right to the body. That had him doubled over. And then finally Dempsey was able to catch up with him in the next round.
The next big fight for Jack Dempsey comes in the form of Georges Carpentier from France. A couple of notes about this before we get into what this fight was all about. So, according to the Wikipedia page, this is where he wins what would eventually become the WBA heavyweight title. He also retains his lineal heavyweight title in this fight. It's fought in Boyles 30 Acres, Jersey City, New Jersey. Now, if I recall, correct me if I'm wrong, in between Brennan and Carpentier, he is sued by his ex-wife at the time. He is his war record, or lack thereof, was called into question. He did not fight in World War I. However, he did do forms of service in terms of fundraising, bond raising, appearances. As he puts it, at least as far as the movie goes, he was not called to fight. I believe he received a deferment, being the sole the person who takes care of his family, provider of his family, and so he was not asked to go into the war. But he is called, and this is the term that is bandied about, the slur, he's called a slacker for not enrolling, not enrolling, for joining the military. And so, you have this war hero, Georges Carpentier of France, who comes across the pond to fight the slacker, the guy who didn't do his duty, in the villain, the heel, Jack Dempsey. So, where does that leave us, Pat?
Well, there's also one big issue, and this was one of the big issues that led to Dempsey and Kearns splitting, aside from the money dealings. Kearns wanted to do a publicity deal with Dempsey helping out at a military base and working and putting scrap together and everything. So there's this very famous photo where he had Jack show up and put on work clothes and everything, and Jack's supposedly working, but he has these patent leather shoes on. And it was a horrific press disaster because he was called out on it immediately.
He's wearing fancy boy shoes, in other words?
Bingo.
Gotcha.
So, rather than... That was Kearns' answer, rather than come out with the truth and just fight with, hey, he received a deferment. He's the only breadwinner for the family. That's why he's not fighting in the war right now. And
which was a thing, by the way. We were not into creating widespread poverty by destroying all the the earners of every family across the nation. That this is a thing that happened.
Yeah, war was going on, but at the same time, people still had lives back at home.
Right.
And people were a little more conscious of it, but they used it to their advantage to promote this fight where you have this decorated war hero who not only was beloved in France and Europe, but they loved him in the U.S. too. George Bernard Shaw, the playwright, who was himself a tremendous boxing fan and would become great friends with Gene Tunney later on in life, he had touted Carpentier as the best boxer in the world. And so there was a lot of media and hype for this. This would be the equivalent of like the Mayweather-McGregor level hype that we saw a couple of years back.
Oh my. So they fight, and Jack Dempsey KOs him in round 4.
Yeah, Carpentier had a brief moment where he was able to land a good right hand over the top on Dempsey, but even the people in the know who loved Carpentier, they really looked at this as a mismatch. Carpentier coming up from light heavyweight, where he was a tremendous fighter, and Dempsey was not a huge heavyweight in terms of his stature or his weight. His prime fighting weight was somewhere around 185 pounds, 180 pounds. So it wasn't a size. It's just they felt that as the slightly bigger natural man with the styles involved, that Dempsey was going to bring the fight to Carpentier and eventually catch him. And he does. And like you said, this is an interesting footnote. The fight here is the first heavyweight championship fight recognized by the National Boxing Association, which is what eventually would evolve into the WBA, the World Boxing Association, that is still one of the major sanctioning bodies recognized today.
Which is now currently held by Anthony Joshua, who's known as the super champion. There is a regular champion. He may never fight again. I have no idea what's happening with this fella. So, between 1919 and this fight, our champion, Jack Dempsey, there were periods where he was doing exhibition bouts and carnival attractions. He was making appearances. He was also doing movies. There's a really funny scene in Dempsey where he's doing something of an action sequence and literally knocks the actor out and the set. It was rather amusing, and the director gets up and says, "What are you doing? Stop killing the actors." It's fantastic. But apparently he was quite the celebrity, and he got a lot of work outside of boxing. There's a 2-year...
He married a movie star.
He did. He liked the actress women, Jack Dempsey. He was into Broadway starlets and Hollywood actresses. It was fantastic.
Yeah, so at this time he marries Estelle Taylor, and through this kind of, I won't call it Tyson Givens, but it's, the slugger and the starlet type thing, and that's how he got his foot in the door where they made him a movie star, and she actually convinces him before he starts doing these movies to get a nose job to make himself more cosmetically appealing to the camera, which he does.
He was fairly successful. I mean, he's got a number of pictures under his belt. I don't have the exact list in front of me right this second, but he didn't do too bad for himself in Hollywood. But he is a fighter, and he was the champion, and so eventually gets back in the ring. This is now 2 years later. It's 1923 in Shelby, Montana. The fight that would bankrupt the town.
Yes.
Tommy Gibbons. I guess this goes to a decision, or just I'm not really sure how to read this. Maybe you can fill in the blanks for me. It says PTS, 15 rounds. It
is a 15-round points decision for Dempsey, who struggled a lot with the very clever boxer Tommy Gibbons, part of a pair of fighting brothers with his brother Billy. And Gibbons, again, a natural light heavyweight who had moved up to heavyweight for greater success, and a real cutie type of style, which is the type that really frustrated Dempsey, where you could not get to him easily despite what you were doing, and they would peck and paw at you and move and just really fight scientifically.
At this point, let me ask you now: does Dempsey change his? He's super aggressive in the Willard fight, and I wasn't able to look at a tremendous amount of footage between Willard, Carpentier, and then Firpo, which we'll talk about next. But over time, does he slow it down? Does he get to a place where he's resetting, or is it still just duck your head, bull rush the guy, and then throw 900 punches?
He had fights like this one with Tommy Gibbons, like Bill Brennan to an extent, where it kind of almost influenced him to think maybe there was more to what he needed more to what he was doing, and tried to take a more patient approach, which people would argue actually cost him later on. And
left himself too many openings, is what you're saying?
It's Dempsey's best defense wasn't his head moving and bobbing and weaving. It was good. His best defense was forcing the other guy onto the defensive with his offense. And when that wasn't what it was, when he wasn't constantly forcing the pressure and making these guys have to do things, and they had time to sit, think, and reset, it wound up being detrimental to him stylistically.
So he benefited from being super aggressive, and when he was doing that, he did better than when he was a bit more pensive, more technical fighter.
He did, and it's one of those things where there's an innate level of just toughness in somebody that allows them to be successful with that. You can have great punching power, you can have great hand speed, but if you are not mentally willing to just say, I'm going to take what they give me because I'm not going to stop coming, it won't work for you. But for him it did. For other guys we'll talk about later on, it did. And there's just that innate level of toughness and sacrifice that you're willing to have that is really, more than anything, more than punching power, more than hand speed, that's really what separated them from everybody else.
Premier boxing magazine at the time, The Ring, has at this point been giving out titles. So in this fight, according to the notes here, he retains the Ring and lineal heavyweight titles. A few months later, he returns to New York. It's a hell of a town. And he fights from Argentina. And this is fantastic, this fight. Luis Angel Firpo. Not to be confused with Vampiro Firpo. KO in the second round, September 14th, 1923. Retains the New York State Athletic Commission, the Ring and lineal heavyweight titles. Oh my goodness. We are back to just brutality. The sweet science goes right out the window, and yet another mugging takes place. What?
Two rounds, 11 knockdowns.
Yeah. I know that this wasn't a thing back then, but I am really surprised nobody threw in the towel and tried to save this man from being beaten to death.
It was insanity at its best level. You're talking not even 2 full rounds, we should say. It's like a round and a half, but we have 11 knockdowns take place. And Firpo had built a tremendous reputation coming into this fight as a massive puncher. He was a big guy for the time. They list Dempsey at 6'1", which I think is generous when we see him stand with guys like Willard and Firpo. Firpo was 6'3", but Firpo was a thick 6'3". He weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of about 220 pounds, which, again, we talk about Dempsey's prime fighting weight being roughly 40 pounds less than that. And he's out there, and he's just knocking out everybody he sees. Firpo's knocked out Willard. He's knocked out Bill Brennan. He's knocked out some leading contenders of the time, and he's done it on some Dempsey undercards in towns right after Dempsey had been there. So there's a lot of demand for this fight. And in no way does it disappoint. This is just, we talk about how savage the Willard fight was. This is two-way savagery in many respects.
Yeah, Firpo was actually in this fight. You know, the Willard was just a one-sided shellacking. This one, I mean, he gets knocked out, and rightly so, but he at least fights back and actually makes contact with Dempsey.
And the knockdown disparity, Dempsey dropped Firpo 9 times. Firpo dropped Dempsey twice.
Right.
However, it's the second knockdown he scores that's one of the most famous in history.
Oh, boy. So, in the Willard fight, you know, can we just keep Jack Dempsey in the ring is what I'm about to tell you. This guy, first he leaves the ring, granted, under controversy. This second time, he gets knocked down and goes ass over tea kettle through the bottom and middle rope onto a reporter in a sea of typewriters. It's fantastic. And there's a lot of controversy about this because you have 20 seconds if you happen to get knocked outside of the ring to get back into the ring, and you were supposed to get up of your own power. Meanwhile, these reporters are buried under, 200 pounds of Jack Dempsey, and they're like, get off! get in there and fight. So they're shoving him and putting him back in the ring. And so, I don't have a major problem with it. It's not like, that they were propping him up once he got there. But, help a man out when he goes through the ropes. That's all I'm saying. But yes, knocked through the ropes, lands on a reporter, and beats the 20 and the 10 count, and gets back in the fight and eventually wins the thing. But that is a brutal and hilarious moment.
And one of the most famous paintings you'll ever see is the painting of Firpo knocking Dempsey out of the ring.
I'll have to look for that.
You'd know it immediately if you saw it.
Yes, indeed. So
it's actually in the Whitney Museum of Art, and I want to say it's George Bellows who painted it, but you'll know it immediately upon seeing it.
I saw some artwork with I was looking for something for the Jess Willard Jack Dempsey fight for the podcast picture, and when I put that in Google Images, I got a lot of Willard standing menacing over, hunched over Dempsey. Which, okay, so when he hunches over, he's about to attack Willard and make Willard pay for it. But if you just look at the static image, it looks like Willard's about to kill this cowering man. This is not how that fight went.
No, it's not.
So there's a 3-year gap here. Talk to me about this 3-year gap. What happens between 1923 and 1926?
So during this time, we have another sanctioning body emerge, which is the New York State Athletic Commission, which also began to recognize champions of its own. And so this fight between Dempsey and Firpo was the first contested for the New York State Athletic Commission championship, which held ties with other organizations. We'll get to that later on in the 1960s. But here, in the 3-year gap between Dempsey's fight with Firpo and his next bout, he's, as we talked about, becoming a movie star. He is gallivanting around Broadway and vaudeville and really enjoying his celebrity. He's not doing a lot of training so much as he's doing some active exhibitions in between, movie shoots and Broadway appearances and vaudeville appearances. And he's kind of taking a moment to where now that people have really kind of forgiven the war record issue, they've embraced him as this hero. And especially after the effort in the Firpo fight, he's kind of launched into this new level of celebrity and cultural icon. And he's more than anything enjoying a lot of his life right now, and not really loving boxing as such. He scheduled one fight during this time, and there's a lot of controversy around this because Dempsey is technically another one of the heavyweight champions who drew the color line. Although that had more to do with his manager, Jack Kearns, and Kearns' policy. Dempsey during this time signs to fight a black contender named Harry Wills. And there's a lot of disagreement about whether Dempsey avoided him, he didn't avoid him, and supposedly Dempsey had said when he won the title he wouldn't be fighting black fighters anymore. There are actual photos of Dempsey and Harry Wills sitting together signing a contract for the fight to take place. So, unfortunately, the money that they produced to have this fight happen fell through because the guy who was promoting it is a guy named Floyd Fitzsimmons, who is a promoter in the Midwest. And he gave Harry Wills a check for his fee, his guarantee for the fight, but he couldn't make Dempsey's money happen. And it just fell through. Wills actually tried to sue Dempsey for breaching his contract, but at the time, if you're a black man trying to sue the white heavyweight champion of the world, the law's not going to be on your side. And unfortunately, Harry never got the opportunity to fight for a championship. But in that 3-year period, that's the only fight Dempsey was tried to schedule. He gets involved in endorsing products, and not commercials, but he's doing print ads for things. And maybe one of the weirder points, Dempsey is an American of Irish descent. So in Dublin, there's a communist labor group called the Irish Worker League that offers him an executive position.
Oh, Jack Dempsey, how political you got. So that takes us to Sesquicentennial Stadium in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, where things start to take a downward spin, at least in his boxing career. He will lose a unanimous decision to your new lineal heavyweight champion and NBA and ring, Gene Tunney. I watched the footage on this fight, and this looked like a boxing match. This is where sort of my bombastic, oh my god, this killer kind of falls away, and I'm like, I'm watching a boxing match. And yeah, Gene, from what I could tell from the footage that I saw, seemed to have gotten Jack Dempsey's number and was able to outclass him technically.
Yeah, there's a great full-length book about Tunney that I can't recommend enough that I had gotten a copy of about 10 years ago. And obviously in that book, they spend a lot of time on the Dempsey fights, and there's almost a narrative through each chapter building towards it. So I thought it was really well done. But a lot of the useful information in there, Tunney idolized two guys as a fighter. As a kid growing up, the first guy he idolized was Jim Corbett. And we talked about Corbett stylistically being the first guy to utilize the jab and a lot of lateral movement and things of that nature. And you see that very evident in how Tunney approaches his fight with Dempsey. The other guy that Corbett had idolized was, while he was an active fighter, the great lightweight champion Benny Leonard, who, much like them, was a master boxer. Lots of movement, feints, jabs, combination punching, getting it out, that type of thing. And the common narrative a lot of times surrounding the Dempsey-Tunney fight is that Dempsey, just couldn't catch Tunney. Tunney stayed away from him. But there are moments in that fight where Tunney takes the fight to Dempsey, where as soon as Dempsey tries to reset or maybe pop up for a second, Tunney fires good combinations and backs Dempsey up and then reestablishes the distance.
It's good to know that in 100 years of boxing, we're still making the same stupid comments.
Yes, exactly. But, again, you're talking about Tunney, who had been the American light heavyweight champion at the time because he had failed to secure a title fight for the actual lineal light heavyweight world championship, but had beaten the best fighters of the day. You're talking about the only guy who got the best of Harry Greb at light heavyweight. And Harry Greb had many sparring sessions with Dempsey where he had gotten the better of Dempsey, and they were never able to get a fight with him for fear of Dempsey losing to the middleweight champion of the world, who had then moved up to light heavyweight and now heavyweight. And Tunney was able to get the better of Greb 5 out of 6 times. He beats Carpentier. He'd beaten pretty much everybody that he could in front of him. And Tunney is one of the more underrated fighters of his time because he has that stigma of defeating a beloved icon and not being a bombastic personality who, captures the public imagination the way Dempsey did, not only because of his personality, but because of his fighting style. When you beat the icon, you don't become the next icon. More often than not, you're looked at negatively, and it's a shame because that's what happened to Tunney in a certain respect. They didn't like the fact that Tunney was not, a partier and a celebrity like Jack Dempsey was. He was spending time with guys like George Bernard Shaw and giving lectures at colleges and doing things of that, where he wasn't what the perception of the heavyweight champion was prior to him.
Nerd.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's even after being a war hero, because his nickname was the Fighting Marine.
He's a sharp-looking dude. He looks like a guy who should be and this is typical, especially in this country. He looks like a guy who should be celebrated. He has good looks, good physique. He's a championship boxer. He's obviously, to the degree that he can be, an intellectual, and the public's like, nope, we like we like other things.
Well, and we'll talk about this later on, but maybe one of the better examples, Buster Douglas knocks out Mike Tyson. Buster Douglas doesn't get any of the critical acclaim or press immediate standing that Mike Tyson had prior to him.
Don't you think, though, in the wake of the Robin Givens interview, that everyone looked at Buster Douglas as, and it's unfair, and I'm not taking up for this argument, but I think Buster Douglas suffers from wrong guy at the wrong time in Tyson's career. A year before, maybe a year later, if Tyson gets his shit together and Buster Douglas beats Tyson, the narrative, I think, changes and favorably for him. But at that time, I think there was too much going on in Tyson's life.
Okay, I'll present to you another example. Muhammad Ali, this icon, this decorated champion, gets beaten by Joe Frazier.
Yes, that's a perfect example.
Joe Frazier does not get any of the acclaim or standing that Ali had prior to him.
And we'll get to that when we get to the Ali episode. But that's a really good example of it's hard, the public can be a fickle mistress, and they don't always like the best guy they should like. They like what they like. Floyd Mayweather draws a lot of criticism for his behavior, for his bombasticness, but there's a reason he does it, and it works, much to the chagrin of many. And it's not changing. We've only been doing this for 200 years.
Yeah. So it is what it is. I mean, Dempsey at this point now, and the fight's only scheduled for 10 rounds, which is even at that point in time uncommon. And it's largely because Dempsey had been out of the ring for so long that they didn't want a longer fight in place.
This does draw a interesting question. When does it become a standard that non-title fights are 10 rounds or less, depending on the level at which you're at, and championship fights are 12 rounds? When does this become a standard across the board?
So the Tommy Gibbons-Dempsey fight was the 15-rounder. That pretty much was supposed to be, as it was going forward, that a championship fight would be 15 rounds. And the Firpo fight was scheduled for 15. They made the exception for the Tunney fights. But even the Jack Sharkey fight, which is Dempsey's comeback fight after he ponders retirement, the Sharkey fight was scheduled for 15 rounds because it wasn't uncommon to have a number one contenders fight go 15 rounds. That practice does get phased out later on, but at this point in time, because it's still new, this is what they tried. And Sharky Dempsey is scheduled for 15 rounds. Now, this is after Dempsey had lost the title to Tunney. They're trying to determine a number one contender, as Sharky has been on the rise. And Sharky, ironically enough, has taken his first name from his hero, Jack Dempsey. There were two fighters that he idolized, one being Dempsey, one being Sailor Tom Sharkey, thus the name Jack Sharkey. Dempsey himself is named after another fighter, which we didn't get to talk about really. He's named after the nonpareil Jack Dempsey, who was a very great middleweight champion who fought prior to the turn of the century.
I believe he also takes over this mantle from his brother, who gave it up.
Well, and that's the thing. He and his brother had both been training to fight. His brother, who had aged to a certain level, who was significantly older than Harry, as his family called him, had had been boxing under the name Jack Dempsey. So William Harrison Dempsey, who we know as Jack Dempsey, takes over that mantle from his brother, and now is fighting a guy who takes part of that mantle from him, which is ironic and funny. And he gets pretty soundly outboxed for 6 rounds. And when Sharkey put it all together, Sharkey was a very good fighter. He just didn't do it that often. In the 7th round, we see Dempsey proceeding to hit Sharkey low a couple times. He does it one more time, and Sharkey turns his head to voice his complaint to the referee. And Sharkey forgets the primary rule of boxing, which is to protect yourself at all times. And Dempsey wallops him with a bodacious left hook that leaves him laying for a count of 10.
And so he is geared up in short order, only a few months later, for the rematch with Gene Tunney, which he will once again lose by unanimous decision in 10 rounds. But he goes out in style. This fight takes place at the football stadium where the Bears play, Soldier Field in Chicago. And that's the last stand for dear old Jack Dempsey, one of the greats in the history of boxing, a Hall of Famer. He was an inaugural inductee into the 1990 International Boxing Hall of Fame. In 1970, he became part of the charter class in the Utah Sports Hall of Fame. The ring's since been disbanded, but he was in there too, their Hall of Fame. He would serve in World War II. He would go on to do charity work. His
celebrity got bigger after his career.
Yes.
He became more appreciated after he retired than when he was actively fighting, which unfortunately happens to a lot of guys. You don't appreciate what you have till it's gone, and he's not there anymore.
Sure.
But we'll talk about Dempsey Tunney too a little bit, because it is one of the most iconic and controversial fights of all time when it comes to the heavyweight championship. And this is often referred to as the long count fight.
Yes.
So there was a lot that went on before this. Al Capone tried to fix the fight, allegedly, to have Dempsey win the title back. So authorities got wind of it. The referee got changed to Dave Barry. So radio was all over the place for this. They did film it. Tunney got the higher payday as the champion, which is now not a common practice. It's whoever they feel is the bigger drawing card gets it. But the money Tunney made for the fight then is today's equivalent of about $15 million. So the fight happens, and Dempsey's corner, and ironically enough, had introduced a new rule that they wanted put into place. To this day, a lot of people don't understand why they wanted it, but they wanted it. It's called the neutral corner rule. And as we talked about before, Dempsey, when he knocked guys down, was able to hover over them, and as soon as they rose from points of contact, could pounce on them. In this fight, the introduction of the neutral corner rule happens where we talked about if a fighter is knocked down, the opponent scoring the knockdown has to be reported to a neutral corner for the count to begin. So in the 7th round, after being outboxed pretty soundly through the first 6, Dempsey finally catches Tunney along the ropes, and he unleashes a trademark Dempsey flurry that puts Tunney on the seat of his pants. Dempsey, however, continues to stand directly over Tunney, and he's standing over him, will not move. Dave Barry, the referee, has to actually physically pull him away and escort him to a corner. This, depending on what count you look at, buys Tunney an additional 5-6 seconds of time before the count can begin. And Tunney takes advantage of it and gets up at the count of 9. That was Dempsey's one real moment in the fight. And a lot of people claim that, he was robbed because he didn't get to get a real count and the rules. Well, first of all, Dempsey's corner insisted on that rule being put into place. So
Here,
don't blame the rule.
Yeah, let me jump in here. Whether or not your corner wanted the rule or not, once the rule is there, you as the professional fighter need to abide by the rules. Just as a point of order, the UFC fight Saturday, a fighter took a knee to the face when he was grounded 3 points of contact and all of that. And the fighter that gave him the knee literally gave the "I brain farted" face. Like, clearly he knew he messed up. And it was written all over his face, all over in his body language. He knew he messed up. So whatever comes of it, he knows he's to blame. He did not, as a professional fighter at the highest level that the sport can offer at this time, should have known better. And sometimes shit happens. I get that. People make mistakes. And it was an honest-to-goodness mistake. And he took his point loss in accordance with that, because you can't do it, and you should know better. In this particular case, as I watched that, again, highest level, you're in a championship fight, you've only been doing this forever. He cost himself that fight. Jack Dempsey, for all intents and purposes, beat himself in that moment. Because when the ref tells you, and you agree to it, and he was told beforehand, go to a neutral corner, you go. This is why they do this preamble now, and have been for years. Follow the referee's instructions at all times. If you decide to be an idiot and not do it, well, everything that follows from that is your own damn fault.
And on top of that, there's one point that a lot of people forget about this. In the next round, Dempsey actually gets dropped by a quick right hand by Tunney. He's not particularly hurt by it. He's not, knocked down for any length of time. It's only a 1 count. But the timekeeper, as opposed to when Dempsey knocked Tunney down, the timekeeper, maybe just out of habit as well, starts the count as soon as Dempsey touched to the canvas, which he's not supposed to do, because Tunney hadn't even made it to a neutral corner by that point. Dempsey pops right back up and the fight resumes. I've watched this fight a lot over the years, and the thought process as well, if Tunney didn't have it all back together, Dempsey could have jumped on him and maybe he wins the title back. I think Tunney was a lot less cloudy than those people believe he was. I think he pretty consciously was aware of everything, and no matter what he was getting counted, he was going to take till 9 to get himself back up. And I don't think the long count altered really the fight in any way.
I would agree with you.
I think that fight plays out exactly the same.
Taking the full count, I've seen that happen a lot in just the past year of televised professional boxing. I've seen plenty of fighters get knocked down, and they're not out. They're not even cloudy, but they're taking the count because they can. It's an opportunity to rest. It's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to get yourself reset. I very rarely see fighters brush it off and immediately run back into action. I mean, the ref won't let you do it now anyway. They do the whole come to me thing, shaking the gloves and all of that. There's a lot more to it now than there is in 1927. But even still.
However, I have seen guys mess up taking the count and accidentally get counted out.
Yeah, I'm sure that's happened too. But I would tell you more often than not, most fighters will get up around 8, 7 or 8, and when they could have got up at maybe 2 or 3. Is my only point. So I'm not going to hold that against Tunney, and I'm not going to be one of these people saying, no, Dempsey was robbed. No, Dempsey lost.
Yeah, and that's the end of him as a fighter. But he, again, becomes this huge cultural icon after the fact, because it's one of those things where he's not appreciated till he's done. And he gets a lot of high-profile gigs after this, as a boxing referee, he actually, for all the knock on his military service during World War II, he became a physical instructor for the Coast Guard, where he was stationed in Brooklyn for a while. He writes a fighting manual at this time, where he would teach you kind of techniques of unarmed combat against armed opponents. It's an interesting life afterward. He and Tunney became good friends later on in life. After the fight, he is still very politically connected. He actually campaigned for Tunney's son when Tunney's son ran for U.S. State Senate in California. One of his best friends was Judge John Sirica, who was the lead judge on the Watergate trial. Um, he opened his restaurant in Times Square in Manhattan, which was open for years. He was known for being in there. It's kind of where Sylvester Stallone took the inspiration for Rocky having a restaurant in Rocky Balboa and hanging out and telling stories. Jack Dempsey did that in New York. Um, he had a movie made about his life that you referenced earlier on TV, starring Treat Williams. That does a pretty decent job of everything. He just became this larger than life figure, and he deserved it in a lot of ways. He did a lot of good for boxing. He did a lot of good for the country, even though he didn't get credit for it. And he lived an incredible life, and he is an iconic champion and deserves that recognition. And interesting footnote, because I know we have a lot of MMA crossover listeners here. Dempsey was one of the first guys who really was a cross-training guy, and it was known in his camps that when he was getting ready for a fight, he also wrestled a lot, and he learned judo. So had there been a UFC way back when, it would have been very interesting to see a guy like Dempsey involved in that.
Do you think any of his judo training, this might seem like a silly question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think any of his judo training helped him in situations where he was dealing with a guy who was constantly tying up with him?
I'm sure that in wrestling did help him a lot with when a bigger opponent would try to get a hold of his arms on the inside. He knew how to use leverage and shoulder rolls and things of that nature to combine and just get out and get into punching range again. And it's funny we talk about the roll. That his particular movement is known as the Dempsey roll, and obviously it's used and modified later on by guys like Mike Tyson. It's actually there's a long-running manga series and anime series in Japan called Fighting Spirit. The name is Hajime no Ippo, and it's about a kid who learns to fight by being inspired by seeing Mike Tyson on tape. And the primary technique that he is specialized in the show is the Dempsey roll, where he uses that upper body momentum to shift, and unleash, flurries of powerful punches with his full body weight behind him. Bruce Lee was a tremendous advocate of Dempsey being the perfect example of what he called the kinetic chain of movement.
All right, and I believe that takes us to the end of our story here in Chapter 2. Where do we go next, Pat? After Tunney, we have who retired with the belt. We have Max Schmeling, who defeated Jack Sharkey. Poor Jack Sharkey. That's all right. Jack Sharkey will eventually win the title. He will be beaten by Primo Carnera, then Max Baer, then Braddock, then, let me guess, next up, Joe Louis?
Yeah. I mean, as an epitaph for this episode, we can kind of just talk a little bit about this stuff briefly. Tunney makes one title defense after Dempsey against Tom Heaney of New Zealand and knocks him out and retires on top. The next two contenders are the German Max Schmeling, who is likened a lot to Dempsey because he physically looks quite a lot like him, and Sharkey, who we mentioned before, who had fought Dempsey. Schmeling wins the title on a foul, first time that ever happened, where he was hit very low by Sharkey and couldn't continue, and the referee awarded the fight to Schmeling. They have a rematch based on the controversial ending, and Sharkey wins a very disputed 15-round decision that most people felt Schmeling got the better of him. And unfortunately for Schmeling, Sharkey's recognized as champion by it. Sharkey, meanwhile, he takes a dive against Primo Carnera.
Is this a Pat Mullin dive or a real dive?
No, this is a real dive. Carnera, who's known as the Ambling Alp, was a mob-controlled Italian heavyweight who had no boxing talent whatsoever. He was just a big, strong guy. And there's actually a couple movies based around his story, Requiem for a Heavyweight, The Harder They Fall, where you take a big, muscular dummy, unfortunately, who doesn't know any better, and just abuse him and use him and build him up and make him think he's this thing that he's not. And when you're done using him, he has nothing left. And it's actually very sad. So he takes that dive against Carnera. Carnera is in fights that are basically mob arranged, where he's made to look good and hold this title, and he runs into Max Baer, who could not care less. Max Baer refuses to take a dive against him. and just abuses him and gives him a very savage beating over 11 rounds before Carnera can even muster anything. He can barely stand up, and it's just a really terrible beating, one of the worst you'll see. And then Bear and his clowning, not taking training seriously, just relying on a big right-hand punch, loses his title to Jimmy Braddock, which I think everybody listening has probably seen the movie Cinderella Man at this point, which in terms of Braddock's story is very accurate. It's not very accurate in its portrayal of Max Baer as a mean, awful killer of a man. He was a pretty lighthearted, easygoing guy who just happened to be a very good right-hand puncher and got beat by Braddock. And that's where we'll leave you off until we pick up the next episode with among the greatest icons in sports.
That is a 7-year period of 1-year champions, by the way.
Yeah, there's a lot of lost years in there.
But the world begins anew June 22nd, 1937 with the great Joe Louis, and that is where we will leave you, and we will pick up with Joe Louis sometime in the immediate future, either by the end of December or the beginning of January. In the meantime, in between time, Pat, I'm gonna nail you down here. I'm going to put you on the spot. Are we doing the Fedor Rampage card?
What's the date on that again?
December 28th.
Oh, God, I can't guarantee it for another week.
Okay. I'm going to keep harassing you about it, though.
That's fine, but we do have Fuller House coming.
We do. Same weekend, as a matter of fact. Pat and I will be together again on December 27th, Friday, December 27th, for the last great season of Fuller House, brought to you by the good people at Netflix. We may or may not be doing Fedor versus Rampage on DAZN, and if we aren't, then I will tap John War, and we will do boxing that night instead, and I'll just watch it after. But Pat is never too far away, and we've always got something cooking. Despite the fact that they're doing an intergender match with fucking Tessa Blanchard, we're going to do this anyway, because goddammit, the rest of the card is balls
and
out.
Nick Gage, who for some reason you like.
I like him ironically. It's not like I'm watching all the GCW stuff that he's in. When he's on, I find him wildly amusing. ICW New York presents No Holds Barred. The ropes are made of chains, ladies and gentlemen. No holds barred, no submissions, only pins, ropes made of chains. Just forget you saw Tessa Blanchard versus Nick Gage. It'll be fine. So we've got that coming up early on in January.
I really want them to book Zeus, though.
Hell yeah. Maybe we can get him as a special referee, or he can come out to the ring with somebody.
No, I want to see him just hit somebody and kill them.
Put him in there with Marco Stunt. Marco Stunt will do anything for $1. Can you imagine that? Little as Jim Cornette calls him, fishy white, tiny, small child, Marco Stunt, and Zeus, chases him around the ring, and he finally gets a hold of him and just tears him in half.
I mean, I watched Scott Steiner versus Hornswoggle, so...
Fair enough. In the meantime, in between time, another episode that dropped today, source material, brought you very much The Wire inspired, I thought. Gotham Central, Book 2, Jokers and Madmen. Last night, the Canadian contingent, Andrew Graham, his lovely wife Alicia, and David Wright joined me for a TV party for The Crown Season 3. Wednesday will be the last Metal Hammer of Doom for 2019. We'll be reviewing Life of Agony, The Sound of Scars, speaking of Brooklyn. And then Thursday night, myself and Sean Comer will be doing a Long Road to Ruin. We dust this off every once in a while for the Santa Claus trilogy. So that'll be fun. Something holiday related. I always enjoy those. Friday night, we've got some boxing for you. We've got Virgil Ortiz versus Brad Solomon on DAZN, and John War will be helping me out with that one. And Saturday night, finally, we've got UFC 245, the triple header of championship fights. Usman versus Covington, Amanda Nunes versus Pig Hostage, and Max Holloway versus Volkanovski. It's going to be fantastic. So UFC 245 coverage. You can check out our coverage of Overeem versus Rosenstruik, where Rosenstruik cracked Overeem's face in half. Yuck. We've also got Teen Titans by Jeff Johns, Knives Out, Rings of Saturn, TV party for Lady and the Tramp on Disney Plus, and Titans Season 2 TV party. Pat, besides the stuff that I hold you hostage and make you do, what else you got going on?
So I'm cooking up some stuff for us to possibly do on Patreon. Some very special stuff that we're going to offer to Patreon-only supporters. It's going to be some fight watch-alongs. It's going to be some other things we're going to do. Excuse me. So just keep an eye out for that stuff through the Radulich and Broadcasting Network. We're going to try to work on some fun stuff, some lists, some countdowns, things of that nature that will always be controversial and upset people, and that's the goal.
Now, I don't keep you all to myself. You are shared by another podcast. Are you doing any work with the casual? Are you, in theory, doing any work with the Casual Heroes?
Who?
Understood. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight on our long, strange trip through heavyweight boxing. Until next time, for Pat Mullin, be well, be safe, and behave.